The House Oversight Committee hearing room was packed to the walls that Tuesday afternoon in Washington, D.C. C-SPAN cameras swept across the dais, catching every tight jaw and restless glance as former Housing and Urban Development Secretary Dr. Ben Carson took his seat at the witness table. Carson looked comfortable, unbothered, like a man who had testified 100 times before. What no one realized yet was that this routine hearing was about to ignite one of the year's most viral political moments. Across from him, Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett leaned forward and adjusted her microphone. Her expression was calm, focused, unwavering. What followed would leave Carson momentarily speechless and send shockwaves across social media. In less than 30 seconds, Crockett would dismantle the narrative Carson had carefully built around expertise and expose who truly understands the struggles of everyday Americans. Dr. Carson, Crockett began, her voice steady but sharp. You've questioned my educational background and implied that I'm not qualified to speak on housing policy, but there's one fact you seem to have overlooked, and once I say it, everyone here will see who's actually out of touch. The room went silent. The faint smile on Carson's face disappeared. Committee members leaned in. Even the camera seemed to hold their breath. What Crockett said next would become the most-watched congressional clip of the month, racking up more than 50 million views in just 48 hours. Before the fireworks, the narrator reminded viewers to like and subscribe so they wouldn't miss other pivotal moments shaping the nation's future, and to comment their location to see just how far the story would travel. To understand why this exchange hit so hard, you have to understand the people at the center of it. Ben Carson is a celebrated neurosurgeon, famous for pioneering the first successful separation of twins conjoined at the head. His political identity was built on medical brilliance and a powerful rise from poverty story. Raised in Detroit against overwhelming odds, he climbed to the very top of American medicine. His soft-spoken demeanor earned admiration across party lines. So when Donald Trump appointed him to lead HUD, many saw the logic. Here was a man who had known poverty and escaped it. But there was another side of Carson's record that rarely made headlines. For all his brilliance in the operating room, Carson had no background in housing policy before running HUD. His tenure was marked with controversy, including a $31,000 dining set for his office and proposals that would have tripled rent for the poorest public housing residents. Critics argued that the man who once knew poverty had grown detached from the communities HUD was meant to serve. Facing him was Jasmine Crockett, a first-term congresswoman who had already earned a reputation as one of the most formidable questioners in House hearings. At 42, Crockett brought a very different kind of expertise. Before Congress, she was a public defender and civil rights attorney. She sat with clients who couldn't pay rent. She saw housing policy play out in eviction courts and cramped kitchens. She didn't have medical awards on her walls, but she had years of first-hand experience fighting displacement, filing housing complaints, and applying the law where it actually mattered. Tension between the two had been building for weeks. On a conservative podcast, Carson had dismissed young progressives who don't understand the complexities of housing markets. He never named Crockett, but the target was obvious. She had been one of his most persistent critics, pressing HUD over its failure to address the affordable housing crisis. Then came the spark. 3 days before the hearing, Carson tweeted, "Some members of Congress would benefit from understanding that running government programs requires more than good intentions. Education and experience matter." The message was unmistakable. Crockett and others like her lacked the pedigree to challenge him. It was credentialism wielded as a weapon. What Carson didn't realize was that he was walking straight into his own trap. On paper, the hearing was routine, HUD's budget proposal for the upcoming fiscal year. In reality, everyone in the room sensed something else was coming. Cameras were locked in, reporters gripped their notebooks, social media teams hovered nearby. This wasn't just oversight. It was political theater, and every seat was filled. Carson opened with the calm, reassuring tone he had perfected. He spoke of fiscal discipline, breaking dependency, and empowering communities through ownership, hitting every note his base expected. And then Jasmine Crockett took the floor. Members rotated through the usual questions: allocations, timelines, budget mechanics. Carson answered smoothly, sprinkling in medical metaphors as if diagnosing the housing crisis from an exam room. He appeared to be gliding toward yet another uneventful appearance. Then Crockett's light came on. "Dr. Carson," she said, cutting cleanly through the gray fog of budget jargon, "I want to talk about qualifications." Carson straightened. A faint smile crept across his face. He'd seen this before, a young progressive invoking compassion. He was ready. "Please, Congresswoman, proceed," he replied. polite on the surface, patronizing underneath. You've said recently that education and experience are required to understand housing policy. You've suggested that some members of Congress, let's be honest, members like me, aren't qualified to question your department. Carson nodded calmly. I simply believe complex policy requires complex understanding. My medical training taught me how to analyze systems, how interconnected parts affect outcomes. That's what I brought to HUD. Your medical training, Crockett repeated, letting the words hang. Yes, Carson said. I served as director of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins for many years. There was pride at the edges of his voice. Very impressive, Crockett replied, her expression suggesting something else entirely. And that qualifies you to run housing policy because... Carson's smile tightened. Because it taught me how to think systematically, to solve complex problems. To perform brain surgery, Crockett cut in, which is extraordinary, truly. She paused. Dr. Carson, when was the last time you personally dealt with an eviction notice? The room stiffened, phones lowered, heads snapped up. I don't see how that's relevant, Carson began. When was the last time you sat with a family being put out of their home, negotiated with a landlord illegally withholding a security deposit, filled out a HUD complaint, not as the secretary, but as someone who needed help? Congresswoman, my experience is in neurosurgery, which is fantastic for brains, Crockett said evenly, but it doesn't automatically translate to housing markets. And since you raised education, let's go there. She slid a folder from her stack. Behind Carson, aides exchanged quick looks. In hearings, a folder rarely bodes well. You earned your MD from the University of Michigan in 1977, residency at Johns Hopkins, undergraduate degree from Yale in psychology, all very prestigious. That's correct, Carson said, trying to anticipate the turn. But as I review your educational record, something's missing. Perhaps you can point it to me. The camera widened to capture both faces. Where did you study housing policy, Dr. Carson? Urban planning, economics, public administration, real estate law. Carson shifted. Leadership skills transfer. That's not what I asked, Crockett said cleanly through. You've argued that education matters for understanding housing policy. So where is your education in housing policy? My experience as secretary. You mean the job you accepted with no prior housing experience? Her voice sharpened. Now, let's talk about my education since you insist. I have a BBA and a JD from Howard University School of Law. I practiced for over a decade in housing discrimination, eviction defense, civil rights, and public housing. She didn't pause. I've represented more than 200 families facing eviction. I filed HUD complaints more than you likely read during your entire tenure. I've stood inside the units you write policy for, smelled the mold, touched the broken heaters, and faced landlords who refuse repairs. She leaned forward. So when we discuss qualifications, tell me, who is more qualified to speak on housing policy, the neurosurgeon who never studied it, or the lawyer who lived it every day? Silence ballooned. Carson opened his mouth, then closed it. A crack appeared in the calm. And do you know what's even more interesting? Crockett continued, her voice dropping into something quiet and dangerous. A Hades leaned in, whispering. One reached toward Carson, but he waved them off. You've built a narrative of bootstraps, escape, hard work, and education. Admirable, she said, but there's a chapter you don't mention. She lifted another document. Cameras clicked. Dr. Carson, did your family receive government assistance when you were growing up? Carson's jaw set. Many families in Detroit. That's not the question. Did your family receive government assistance, yes or no? A beat. Then softly, yes. Specifically, Crockett continued, your family used food stamps, you lived in public housing, you benefited from government programs designed to help poor families, the very programs you later moved to cut. Whispers rippled through the room. Reporters typed furiously. Phones shot back up. Wait, Crockett said, reclaiming the room. There's more, and this part matters most. She stood, angling a page toward the cameras. Yale University financial aid records. Dr. Carson, did you receive need-based aid to attend Yale? Without government-backed loans and grants, could you have afforded that Ivy League education you celebrate? His composure slipped, defensive now, edging toward anger. I worked hard for everything. No one said you didn't, Crockett replied, but you didn't do it alone. You had help, government help, the same help you now deny others. She lowered herself back into her chair. You climbed the ladder, Dr. Carson, and now you're trying to pull it up behind you. One final beat. So when you question my qualifications, she said, when you claim I lack the education or experience to understand housing policy, remember this. I studied the law that governs housing. You studied the brain. I defended families from eviction. You operated on heads. I worked inside the system you now administer. You benefited from the system you're trying to dismantle. She paused. Now tell me again, who is truly qualified to speak about housing policy? The room went still as stone. The man who once performed 30-hour surgeries stared into the empty space before him, his composure fractured. He tried to respond, his mouth opening, then closing, but nothing landed. Separating conjoined twins had been simpler than separating himself from the logic that now pinned him in place. At last, he reached for a thread. Congresswoman Crockett, I think you're mischaracterizing. Am I? Crockett snapped back instantly. What part? That you received government assistance? That you attended Yale with financial aid? That you never studied